The HOA president smiled when she saw the patrol lights climbing the ranch road. "Call the cops," she ordered. Certain Grant Mercer would finally be dragged off the land she wanted. Grant never raised his voice. He simply waited beside the locked gate as Sheriff Wade Hollister stepped from his cruiser, looked at him once, and stopped cold. Years earlier, Grant had commanded the multi-county task force that trained Wade, saved his career, and dismantled one of the largest land fraud rings in the state. But recognition was only the beginning, because Grant had already found something buried inside the HOA records, something that would end far more than a fight over a road. Stay to the end, because the sheriff's recognition exposes a scheme the HOA president never expected anyone to uncover alive. Grant Mercer's life at Mercer Ridge Ranch had been quiet for decades, the kind of quiet that came from land his family had worked long before anyone thought to build a subdivision beside it. Mornings there followed the same unhurried pattern. They always had, feeding the cattle before sunrise, checking fence lines on foot, and driving into town only when he truly needed something. A rhythm that suited a man who had spent enough years chasing other people's chaos for a living and had no interest in inviting more of it into his own. Silver Hollow Estates rose to the east of his property years later, a cluster of new homes with manicured lawns, and a name that sounded more like a resort than a neighborhood. And for a long time the two worlds barely touched, since the development's main road connected directly to the county highway and never needed to cross his fields. Grant paid the HOA no mind, and for a while it seemed to return the favor, its board members waving politely whenever their paths crossed at the feed store or the county fair, treating him as little more than the quiet rancher who kept to himself on the other side of the tree line. That peace ended the afternoon. Cynthia Bellamy mailed him a letter titled Notice of Required Community Access, in which she informed him that the Homeowners Association now claimed the right to use a dirt path through the southern corner of his ranch as a second entrance for the neighborhood. Grant pulled his deed that same evening and confirmed what he already suspected: no such easement existed anywhere in the record. When Cynthia arrived at his gate with two board members trailing behind her, she explained that the community had grown, that home values had climbed, and that one man could not be allowed to stand in the way of hundreds of families. Grant only asked her to show him the recorded easement, and she handed him a photocopied map with a red line drawn across his property. He studied it for less than 10 seconds before handing it back, recognizing it immediately as an old preliminary developer sketch, not a filed legal document. Cynthia insisted the HOA's attorney had already confirmed the association's right to the corridor, but Grant refused to open the gate, and the following morning a sign appeared on the edge of his land reading Emergency HOA Access Do Not Block. Grant removed the sign and set it just outside his boundary line without a word to anyone. Cynthia returned within hours, her tone sharper, now warning him that any further interference with HOA property would bring in law enforcement, and Grant answered simply that this would probably be useful. She mistook his calm for surrender, unaware that he had already begun photographing every sign, saving every email, and copying every document the association sent his way. The same discipline that had once kept entire criminal cases from falling apart in court. It was only after she left that he laid two maps side by side on his kitchen table. The county's official plat beside the version the HOA had been circulating, and noticed that the boundary line on the HOA's copy had shifted by roughly 42 feet. A discrepancy that size was not the kind of thing that happened by accident, and Grant understood even then that someone had drawn that line exactly where they needed it to be. He sat with that thought longer than he expected to, turning the two maps over in his hands under the kitchen light, remembering how many nights he had once spent doing exactly this kind of comparison for a living, tracing the small, deliberate inconsistencies that separated an honest mistake from a manufactured one. It didn't feel like coincidence that the shifted line happened to fall precisely along the corridor Cynthia wanted, and Grant made a mental note the way he always had that precision, like that rarely came from carelessness. The HOA's response came fast. Cynthia sent a formal notice fining Grant $500 a day for what she called obstruction of community access, despite the fact that he had never belonged to the association and had never signed a single covenant in his life. His only reply asked her to identify the document he was supposedly bound by, and when no answer came, a landscaping crew showed up instead. Sent to clear brush along his fence line in preparation for the road, the HOA still insisted it had the right to build. Grant met them before a single blade touched his property, said nothing about threats or authority, and simply showed the crew leader the survey pins driven into the ground and the deed in his hand. The foreman pulled his equipment back within minutes, and when Cynthia learned what had happened, she stood before the community at the next HOA meeting and described Grant as an uncooperative landowner, endangering everyone's property values, careful never to mention that the road she wanted would also open access to an undeveloped parcel behind the neighborhood that a developer had quietly been eyeing for luxury homes. That detail was the one that made Grant stop thinking of this as a dispute about safety and start thinking of it as a dispute about money. He hired an independent surveyor, Caleb Stroud, a methodical man who had spent decades walking property lines across the county and rarely got one wrong to reestablish the boundary once and for all, and the results left no room for interpretation. The road the HOA wanted sat entirely within Grant's property with no recorded easement, no public right-of-way, and no legal claim belonging to the association whatsoever. But Caleb found something worse, buried in a plat the HOA had filed with the county only 6 months earlier, a document showing a 30-foot strip of Grant's land labeled the Silver Hollow Community Access Corridor. Grant asked when it had been recorded, and when Caleb told him, Grant felt something settle in his chest because he had never signed anything, never sold an inch of that land, and never even seen the document before that moment. He didn't raise his voice or reach for his phone to call anyone. He simply asked Caleb to keep the discovery between them while he began building a complete file. The original deed, tax maps, subdivision plats, every letter the HOA had sent, and photographs of every survey marker still standing. It was the same instinct that had once made him the man his old task force trusted to keep a case airtight, and it returned to him now without effort, as if it had never truly left. What he found next made his hands go still over the paperwork. A signature on the corridor document filed with the county recorder bore an unsettling resemblance to his own, close enough that a stranger glancing at both side by side might not question it. But Grant knew with total certainty that he had never signed it, and somewhere beneath that calm exterior, the old instincts that had once hunted forged deeds for a living began quietly stirring back to life. Cynthia decided not to wait for Grant to make the next move. One morning, the sound of diesel engines rolled up the ranch road before Grant had even finished his coffee, low and grinding, growing louder with every passing minute until he set the mug down and walked out to see what was coming. 2 trucks, followed by an excavator, stopped at his southern gate with Cynthia standing beside them in an HOA jacket, a thick folder tucked under one arm, wearing the confident expression of someone who believed the matter had already been settled in her favor. She announced that the contractor had authorization to begin what she called Phase, one of the emergency access project, and Grant walked to the center of the gate without touching a single piece of equipment. He asked the crew supervisor to show him the authorization, and when the man produced a document signed by Cynthia listing the HOA as the property owner, Grant handed over his own deed in response. The supervisor read it once, looked at the excavator behind him, and called the whole crew off the job. Cynthia's composure cracked in an instant, and she shouted that he had no right to stop an approved community project, to which Grant answered only that on his own property he absolutely did. When she accused him of threatening her contractor, Grant pointed silently toward a camera mounted on his barn, and the color drained from her face as she realized the entire exchange had been recorded from start to finish, every word she'd shouted, and every claim she'd made about approved projects now sitting on a hard drive that belonged to the very man she'd tried to steamroll. It occurred to her only then, standing in the dust with the excavator idling uselessly behind her, that she had spent the last several weeks treating Grant Mercer as an obstacle to be worn down rather than a man who might actually be paying close attention to every move she made. The crew left without another word, and Cynthia handed Grant a document she called a final compliance notice before storming off one that revealed the HOA now wanted more than $18,000 in fines and legal fees. Grant laughed for the first time since the letters began, not because of the amount, but because the HOA had just put in writing on their own letterhead an admission that they were trying to enforce covenants on a parcel that had never belonged to their association in the first place. He told Cynthia to keep sending the notices, and when she asked why, he simply said they were useful, a phrase she wouldn't understand the weight of until much later. That night, digging through records the HOA had been required to disclose to its own homeowners, Grant found something larger than a fine or a forged signature. The association had collected what it called a secondary access assessment from residents, totaling more than $310,000. All of it justified to homeowners as the cost of acquiring and improving the very corridor Cynthia claimed the HOA already controlled. But the HOA had never purchased that corridor from anyone because Grant still held the deed, meaning someone had spent more than 3 years' worth of an average salary telling 300 families they were paying for land the association didn't own and had never had any legal path to acquiring. This was no longer a disagreement over a dirt road between neighbors. Somebody had built an entire financial case around ownership that simply did not exist, and Grant intended to find out exactly who that somebody was. The next morning, Cynthia arrived with 2 HOA security guards trailing behind her and announced loudly enough for the whole road to hear that the gate was coming down that day. The days between the excavator standing down and the next confrontation passed slowly, filled with more letters, more threats, printed on association letterhead and a growing sense among Grant's few neighbors on the ranch side of the Postit County that something larger than a fence dispute was quietly taking shape. Grant didn't share his suspicions with anyone, yet not even Caleb, choosing instead to let the file on his kitchen table grow thicker one document at a time, the way he had once built cases that took months to fully expose. Grant secured the gate with a fresh chain and stood inside his own property line as Cynthia approached with 2 HOA security guards and Monica Greer, the association's attorney, walking a step behind. Monica tried to open with a reasonable tone, asking if there was room to talk things through. And when Grant asked her plainly whether she had personally reviewed the deed, she hesitated just long enough for Cynthia to cut in and insist that their lawyers already had everything they needed. That hesitation brief as it was planted, the first real doubt in Monica's mind, though she said nothing more in front of Cynthia. Grant repeated calmly and clearly that the gate stood well inside his recorded boundary, and when Cynthia ordered the security guards to cut the chain, both men refused the moment Grant asked them to confirm in writing that she was directing them to break into private property. Cynthia's composure finally shattered completely, and she screamed at Grant to call the cops. Then, pulling out her phone, she reported to the sheriff's office that a man was blocking a community emergency road, obstructing HOA staff, ignoring a legal access order, and that the situation could escalate at any moment. Grant didn't argue, didn't retreat, and didn't so much as raise his voice. He pulled a folding chair from just inside the gate, set it down in the shade, and sat while he waited. And when Cynthia mocked him for looking remarkably calm for a man about to be removed from his own property, he answered that it depended entirely on who actually owned the gate. Dust rose along the ranch road long before the vehicles came into view, and for a moment the only sound was the wind moving through the tall grass on either side of the drive. No sirens announced the patrol cars climbing the ranch road. Only the slow flash of lights signaled their approach, followed by 2 deputies stepping out ahead of the sheriff's own SUV. Sheriff Wade Hollister emerged last, and before he had taken more than a few steps, Cynthia was already pointing toward Grant, telling him that was the man causing the trouble. Wade turned his head toward Grant, and the moment his eyes settled on him, everything in his posture changed, the practiced authority of a county sheriff giving way for just a second to something closer to disbelief. A silence stretched long enough for Cynthia and both security guards to notice it, and then Wade took 2 more steps forward and said only Commander Mercer. Cynthia looked from Wade to Grant and back again, and Grant answered with a simple nod, telling him it had been a long time. Wade explained briefly, and without embellishment, that decades earlier, as a young deputy barely out of the academy, he had been selected to join the Regional Property Crimes Task Force, a multi-agency unit built to investigate deed fraud, forged titles, stolen agricultural equipment, mortgage scams, and organized schemes to seize land through falsified paperwork. It had been an unglamorous assignment at the time, more spreadsheets and courthouse records than car chases, but it taught Wade to read a document the way most officers were taught to read a crime scene, and that skill had followed him through every promotion since. Grant Mercer had commanded that unit, and one case under his leadership, a sprawling scheme that had stripped dozens of elderly landowners of their property through forged transfers, had shaped the entire trajectory of Wade's career and taught him more about patience than any training manual ever could. Cynthia's expression shifted from confusion to accusation almost instantly, and she declared that Grant was clearly using old connections to intimidate the HOA, but Grant cut her off before Wade could respond, saying flatly that he hadn't asked Wade for a single thing. That distinction mattered enormously to him. He had no interest in Wade taking his side out of loyalty to the past, only in the facts being examined honestly, and Wade seemed to understand this instinctively, stating that they would handle the matter strictly by the record. He asked both parties to produce their documentation on the spot, and Cynthia handed over the HOA's plat while Grant laid out his recorded warranty, deed the county tax parcel map, Caleb's new survey, the historical plat photographs of the survey markers, and copies of every letter the association had sent him. Wade spread the papers across the hood of his cruiser under the late morning sun, arranging them carefully the way Grant remembered him doing years earlier, always methodical, never rushing past a detail that might matter later, and it was one of his deputies who first noticed that the legal description in the HOA's filing didn't match the deed at all. Cynthia dismissed it as a technical discrepancy, but Grant simply asked them to run the instrument number through the county system, and a deputy placed the call to records right there at the gate. The answer came back within minutes. The document the HOA had been relying on wasn't an easement at all, but a preliminary planning exhibit, a document that granted no ownership, no access rights, and certainly no authority to cut a chain on private land. Wade announced on the spot that no one had permission to enter Grant's property or remove the lock without lawful cause, though he stopped short of arresting anyone. And Grant didn't push him to. It was only afterward, once Cynthia and her guards had stepped back toward their vehicles, that Grant showed Wade the document bearing the signature that looked so much like his own. Wade studied it in silence, then looked up at Grant with the same expression he'd worn the moment he first said Commander, understanding without needing to be told that this had stopped being a neighborhood dispute and become something the two of them had spent years of their lives chasing down. Grant told him quietly that this was exactly why he'd been glad Cynthia had called him. Wade checked the notarization date stamped across the bottom of the corridor document, and the date didn't sit right with him. On that exact day, county travel records would later confirm Grant Mercer had been out of state entirely, and he had the documentation to prove it beyond any argument. Wade instructed everyone to leave Grant's property, while the paperwork issue moved into a formal review, and Cynthia drove straight back to the HOA office to call an emergency board meeting before the story could get ahead of her. She tried to frame the encounter as Grant using old law enforcement ties to intimidate a sitting sheriff, but Monica Greer still turning over. That earlier hesitation in her mind asked a question Cynthia clearly hadn't prepared for. Where had the signed access document actually come from? Cynthia answered vaguely that the developer had supplied it, and when Monica pressed for the original email chain, nothing materialized. At almost the same time, Renee Talbot, the HOA treasurer, raised her own concerns about the $310,000 assessment, and Cynthia kept postponing any real answer, a pattern the board was beginning to notice. Grant, for his part, never appeared before the HOA during this stretch, letting the paper trail speak for him while Wade deliberately stepped back from any direct role in the property investigation, aware that his history with Grant could raise questions about impartiality if he got too close. A county investigator entirely independent of the sheriff's office was assigned to take over, and if anything, that made the process harder on Grant rather than easier, since every document he produced was now scrutinized without the benefit of an old friendship in the room. Caleb turned over his full survey records, and the county recorder confirmed there had never been a legal transfer of the corridor parcel to the HOA at any point in its history. The notary stamp on the disputed document created an even bigger problem when investigators discovered that the notary's office had closed its doors months before the date printed on the filing, meaning the document couldn't have been legitimately notarized at all. A detail so glaring that even the investigator assigned to the case admitted he had rarely seen a forged filing carry such an easily disprovable flaw. Grant, when Wade later told him about it, only shook his head. Having seen the same pattern more times than he could count over the years, the kind of overconfidence that came from people who assumed no one would ever bother to check the small details buried beneath the larger lie. Around this time, Renee reached out to Grant privately, not asking him to save the HOA, only asking what she should do if she found financial records that looked wrong. Grant didn't tell her to take anything that wasn't hers to take. He told her only to preserve whatever she already had lawful access to, and to change nothing about it. The same instruction he might have given any witness decades earlier. Renee began combing through the accounting archive. She could legally access as treasurer, staying late in the HOA office after everyone else had gone home, scrolling through line item after line item of routine landscaping invoices, maintenance fees, until one entry made her stop scrolling entirely. It was a payment of $74,500 sent from HOA funds to a company called Bellamy Land Consulting, listed under a vague description that simply read consulting services, a name Cynthia had never once mentioned to the board in any meeting Renee could remember attending. Renee ran the company through the state's business registry that same night, and the registered agent listed for Bellamy Land Consulting was Cynthia Bellamy herself. Renee handed everything she'd found to the county investigator through entirely legal channels, and from there the full shape of the scheme began to surface. Cynthia's real motive had nothing to do with community safety at all. A developer had been circling an undeveloped parcel behind Silver Hollow Estates, and without a convenient second entrance, that land carried a far lower price tag than it would with one. A road cut through Grant's ranch would have solved that problem instantly, boosting the value of the developer's project, and investigators soon learned triggering a payment to whoever had helped secure the access. Emails obtained during the review showed Cynthia telling the developer directly that the HOA controlled the southern access corridor, a claim that was false on every level, and a draft agreement uncovered alongside those emails referenced a consulting success fee payable to a third party once the faction's 11 access arrangement was finalized. For Grant, the picture clicked into place with an almost clinical clarity. Cynthia wasn't fighting to defend a subdivision's shared interests. She was racing to make her lie true before anyone thought to check the actual title. It was a pattern he recognized instantly from his years commanding the task force. The same shape every land fraud. Eventually took a story told with just enough confidence that no one bothered questioning it until the money had already changed hands. And Grant found himself almost grateful that Cynthia had pushed so hard so publicly, because it meant she had left a trail wide enough for anyone willing to look to follow straight back to her. Cynthia tried to turn the community against him one more time, circulating a letter, accusing Grant of trying to destroy the neighborhood's property values out of pure stubbornness. But this time the homeowners didn't simply nod along. Dale Whitaker stood up at the next general meeting and asked the only question that mattered: if the HOA truly owned that corridor, why couldn't anyone produce the deed? No one could. Renee formally requested a full public accounting of association funds, and Cynthia responded by attempting to have her removed from the treasurer position altogether, a move Monica flatly warned her against, reminding the board that destroying financial records at this stage would constitute a serious legal violation. When Cynthia snapped back that she was still the HOA president and could run her own board as she saw fit, Monica's reply was short and final: that title didn't make her the owner of the evidence. Grant still hadn't set foot in an HOA meeting, content to let Cynthia's own choices continue isolating her from the people who had once trusted her. It was the investigators' review of the altered plat that delivered the sharpest blow yet. The 42-foot shift in the boundary line hadn't been some careless drafting error, as Cynthia had once suggested. It was precisely calibrated to move the access route off HOA-owned land and squarely onto Grant's property, a change no honest cartographer makes by accident. Someone had deliberately reshaped a legal document to fit a story they needed the world to believe. And the metadata buried inside that digital file would soon point investigators directly toward the office computer where it had been created. That trail led straight to a laptop inside the HOA office, one that had been logged in at the exact time the file was altered under Cynthia's own user account. Word of the investigation spread through Silver Hollow long before any official notice went out, carried from driveway to driveway, the way news always seemed to travel in a neighborhood built around shared mailboxes and community barbecues. And by the time the board finally scheduled a special meeting, nearly every household had already heard some version of the story. Silver Hollow Estates called that special meeting once the investigators' findings became too significant to keep behind closed doors, and for the first time since the dispute began, Grant walked in. He wore no uniform, carried no badge, brought no entourage, only a single binder tucked under his arm. Cynthia tried to seize control of the room, immediately arguing that Grant wasn't an HOA member and therefore had no standing to address the board at all, her voice carrying just a trace of the same authority that had worked on this crowd so many times before. But Dale reminded everyone that the matter directly concerned Grant's land and well over $300,000 in resident funds, and this time the room didn't simply defer to her the way it always had, murmurs of agreement rippling through the rows of folding chairs until the homeowners voted overwhelmingly to give Grant 5 minutes at the podium. Grant didn't use those 5 minutes to talk about his old career or the task force or anything Wade had said at the gate. Instead, he set 3 documents up on the screen at the front of the room: the true deed, the original plat, and the version the HOA had filed with the altered boundary, and told the room simply to forget who he used to be and look at the people. Line. It was the same instinct that had carried him through the entire ordeal, an unwavering focus on the paperwork over the person, and it landed harder in that room than any appeal to his past ever could have. Caleb walked the board through the survey findings point by point, and Renee laid out the assessment record showing exactly where $310,000 of resident money had actually gone. Monica confirmed on record that she had never advised the board that the HOA held any ownership claim to the corridor, and that Cynthia had badly misrepresented her legal counsel to the very people who trusted her most. When Cynthia tried to shift blame onto the developer, claiming she had simply been relaying what she'd been told, Renee pulled up an email sent from Cynthia's own account that read, "Once Mercer gives and the corridor issue disappears," and the room went completely silent. Cynthia turned to Grant, her voice shaking now, and accused him of planning this entire collapse from the very beginning. And Grant answered simply that he hadn't planned anything. She had documented it herself, one email and one filing at a time. It was at that exact moment that Sheriff Wade Hollister walked through the door alongside the county investigator, not to rescue Grant, but to formally request access to every computer and financial record the HOA possessed as part of an active inquiry. Cynthia looked at Wade, then at Grant, and something in her expression finally cracked open, the full weight of her mistake settling in. She hadn't just made the error of calling the sheriff to force a rancher off his own land. She had pulled a former commander of a property fraud task force directly into the one kind of case he had spent his entire career learning to unravel. The investigator asked for full access to the HOA's computers and financial records that same evening, and Cynthia rose from her seat as though she meant to walk straight out of the building, but the HOA's own attorney stopped her, cold, telling her plainly not to touch anything. The unraveling that followed didn't come as a single dramatic arrest. It came in layers, each one stripping away another piece of the life Cynthia had built, slowly enough that she seemed to spend those weeks in a kind of disbelief, as though she still expected the entire matter to quietly resolve itself in her favor the way so many disagreements at Silver Hollow always had before. The developer quietly withdrew from the land deal the moment the title dispute became public record, unwilling to risk the project on a court or claim that had already collapsed under scrutiny. The HOA's insurance carrier opened its own review soon after, and the board voted to freeze Cynthia's ability to authorize any spending without full board approval, a power she had wielded almost unchecked for years. Homeowners demanded an independent audit of every dollar the association had collected under her leadership, and Bellamy Land Consulting became the center of that audit almost immediately, with payment after payment surfacing that Cynthia had never disclosed to a single member of the board. Faced with a wall of evidence, she could no longer talk her way around. The board moved to formally remove her from the presidency, and the vote wasn't close, with even a few of the members who had once counted themselves among her closest allies raising their hands without hesitation once the full extent of the numbers had been laid out in front of them. Cynthia sat through the vote in silence, her folder of talking points untouched on the table beside her, and for the first time in the entire ordeal, she seemed to understand that no amount of confidence or connections was going to talk her way out of what her own records had already confirmed. In one last attempt to salvage her image, Cynthia told the room that Grant had destroyed the community simply because he refused to share a road, her voice rising with a desperation that hadn't been there in any of her earlier speeches. Dale answered her with a single sentence that ended the argument for good, delivered without any anger at all, just plain fact, laid bare in front of everyone it was never their road to begin with. Grant was encouraged by more than one attorney to pursue significant damages against the association, and at least one of them made it clear the numbers involved could have set him up comfortably for the rest of his life. But he made a deliberate choice to separate Cynthia's actions from the many homeowners who had known nothing about what she'd done behind closed doors, aware that punishing 300 families for the choices of one would only repeat in a smaller way the very unfairness he had spent this entire ordeal fighting against. What he asked for instead was straightforward. The HOA would withdraw every fine, drop any claim to his land cover. The cost of the survey and legal review, repair the fencing that had been damaged, formally record the correct boundary, agree never to enter his property again without a proper, negotiated agreement in place. Then, in a move that surprised almost everyone in the room, Grant offered something the HOA had never earned, and certainly hadn't expected: a narrow, tightly restricted emergency easement, usable only by fire and rescue crews in genuine emergencies, with no developer access, no construction traffic, and no HOA authority over it whatsoever. Cynthia had tried to take everything through deception. Grant, holding every card, chose to give back only what safety actually required, drawing a clear line between power and the abuse of it. After the meeting ended, Wade found Grant in the parking lot and told him, half-joking, that he was still teaching people something even now. Grant answered that Wade had stopped needing a commander a long time ago, and the two men shook hands the way old colleagues do without needing to say much else. Before Wade climbed back into his cruiser, he mentioned that the financial investigation into the HOA was far from finished, because the $74,500 payment to Bellamy Land Consulting had turned out to be only the first irregular transaction investigators had found, with more still waiting to be traced. In the months that followed, Silver Hollow Estates rebuilt its leadership almost entirely from the ground up, a process that felt at times more like recovery than governance, with residents attending meetings in numbers no one had seen since the neighborhood's earliest days, determined to understand exactly how so much money and authority had drifted into the hands of one person without anyone noticing until it was nearly too late. Renee agreed to serve on a temporary reform board to help stabilize the association, but firmly declined any permanent leadership role, wanting no part of the kind of unchecked authority Cynthia had once held. The HOA brought in an independent accounting firm to review its books going forward, and the community's governing covenants were rewritten to prevent any single president from signing major agreements without full board approval ever. Again, surveyors returned to properly mark the true boundary along Grant's land, driving fresh stakes into the same ground. Caleb had walked months earlier, and the sign that once read emergency HOA access disappeared for good, replaced by a repaired fence line and corrected county records that finally matched reality. Neighbors who had once avoided the subject entirely began stopping by the edge of Grant's property just to see the new fence for themselves, some offering quiet apologies for ever believing the story Cynthia had told them, others simply nodding at him the way people do when they've come to understand, a little late, who had actually been telling the truth all along. The developer walked away entirely from any plan involving a road through the ranch, and Cynthia was left to face the mounting consequences of an investigation, ongoing civil claims, and a growing list of financial transactions that painted a picture no explanation could soften. The network of influence she had spent years quietly constructing came apart not because of anything Grant said in public, but because of the very documents she herself had signed, filed, and hidden. Grant returned to the rhythm of ordinary life on the ranch, the kind of quiet that had defined his days long before any of this began. Waking before dawn to check on the cattle, mending the last stretch of fence that had gone untouched during the months of conflict, and finding somewhat to his own. Surprise that the silence felt different now earned in a way it hadn't been before. One afternoon, Wade stopped by unannounced and stood looking at the gate that had once been the center of the entire conflict, remarking with a small laugh that most people got nervous the moment somebody threatened to call the police. Grant told him that most people should get nervous when their own paperwork starts looking fake, and Wade laughed harder at that, then asked something that had clearly been sitting with him for a while. Why had Grant never once told the HOA who he used to be? Grant looked out toward the new stretch of fencing before answering that who he used to be shouldn't be what decides who owns the land. When Wade asked him then what should decide it, Grant simply held up the old worn deed in his hand and said this. Looking back on it later, even Grant had trouble pinpointing the exact moment the balance of the fight had shifted, whether it was the 42 feet of moved boundary, the notary office that had closed its doors months too early, or simply the look on Cynthia's face, the instant Wade said his old rank out loud. What he did know with total certainty was that none of it would have mattered without the paper trail, without the deed he had kept, the survey he had ordered, and the patience he had never lost even when it would have been easy to. The story circled back in the end to the exact moment Cynthia had screamed for someone to call the cops, certain that a badge and a patrol car would be enough to force a rancher off land he had every right to hold. What arrived instead was a deputy she had never met before, a man who had once learned under Grant's own guidance precisely how to spot a forged deed and how far people would go to make one look real. And from the instant Wade said the words, "Commander Mercer," the fight was never really between Grant and the Homeowners Association anymore. It became a fight between Cynthia Bellamy and the very documents she had created with her own hands, filed with her own signature, and believed right up until the very end that no one would ever think to check. Cynthia called the sheriff because she believed a badge would be enough to make Grant surrender his land. She never imagined that the sheriff standing in front of her had already learned years before exactly how to protect that land from people like her, and by the time she finally understood that there was nothing left in her folder or her defense that could change what the record now permanently showed.